Question?
I have this extra credit. You're going to just staple it and put it on your desk.
As we've been looking at the Second Great Awakening, we looked at the Eastern phase of the Awakening and then the Western phase, which continues to have an effect on American Christianity to this day. Within that Western phase, we saw the rise of the camp meeting, the formation of some new denominations. We have men like Barton Stone who promoted the camp meeting. And then we moved on to another result of the Second Great Awakening and the interest that people had in religion, and that was Charles Finney's revival. So we were looking at what he did, and particularly the theology behind it. Now we're going to continue looking at the influence of religion in America during this time period, as more and more people are interested in religious things. Not only were there those that came to saving knowledge of Christ through the Awakening, some probably through Finney, but there are also different religious groups that arose during the time which we today call cults. It's interesting that in this time period is when we have the rise of many of our modern day cults. So in your notes, you're taking your own notes now, you'll be able to follow along, I think, easily the outline that I have for you as we proceed looking at this section, which we'll call the rise of the cults. The rise of the cults. First of all, we have to define what is a cult. Sometimes people have the wrong idea. Sometimes people use that word in a lot of different ways. But there's a certain usage that we have in mind when we're talking about an American cult. First of all, there's a time factor. We're talking about a religious group that arose sometime after 1800. And usually in the early 1800s is what we're looking at here. So there's a time factor. Secondly, there's a doctrinal factor. There is a denial of some essentials of Protestant orthodoxy. So in other words, there are some basic beliefs that evangelical Christians, Bible-believing Christians have always held that they vary from. They have some different notion of something that is key or essential to the Christian faith. Thirdly, there's the authority factor. And that is, for most of them, there is a low view of Scripture, and they have certain sacred writings that are either equal to or higher than the Scriptures. So we're going to see that for most of these, they have some book that they go to as being the authoritative Word of God or Word from God that is either equal to the Scriptures or supersedes the Scriptures. So that's the authority factor. What's the authority? Or their epistemological source, if you prefer that. And then next, there's the leadership factor. For most of these groups, there is a founder, which requires strict obedience, and who is revered as a prophet. And lastly, there is an organizational factor. That is, they are exclusive. They're the only ones with the truth. So if you want to know the truth, you have to be in their group, in their organization. So when we're talking about a cult, an American cult specifically, we're talking about a religious organization that arose since 1800, that denies some essentials of Christian orthodoxy, in which there is usually a sacred writing that's equal to or higher than Scriptures. There's a founder which requires strict obedience, who is a prophet, and they are the only ones with the truth. Any questions? I saw a cartoon some time ago which illustrated the difference between a church and a cult. Here's a church, somebody speaking and everybody's sleeping. Here's a cult, guy with a book and a gun, and everybody's very alert because their life depends on it. The extravagant emotionalism that accompanied the revivals in the burned over district, remember primarily in the New York area, where revivals kept going over and over again in the same ground, led to claims of prophetic gifts and infallible revelations from God, which were well received by a superstitious and credulous people. So the emotionalism associated with the Second Great Awakening and with Finneyism led people to look for more and more fantastic and emotional experiences, and were very susceptible to believing what somebody told them they experienced. The first of these cults that we're going to look at is Mormonism. Does anybody know who the founder of Mormonism is? Stephen?
Joseph Smith?
Right, Joseph Smith. Actually, Jr. Joseph Smith, Jr. Let's find out a little bit about him. And a lot of these things are not something that you need to write down when you're talking about when he's born and all that. Just as a frame of reference, he was born just a couple days before Christmas. In 1805 in Vermont, he was the third son in the family. He was rather insecure as the family moved 3 times before he was 5 years old. His parents barely eked out a living. They had little education, so very poor family, constantly on the move, little education. As an adolescent, he became known for tall tales and necromantic arts. Anybody know what necromantic means? It means doing things related to the dead, contacting the dead, contacting spirits. He led a band of idlers. In other words, kind of he has his own little gang there, in digging for buried treasure. He was arrested and charged with being a disorderly person and an imposter. So he's known for telling stories that weren't true, for trying to contact spirits, and for looking for buried treasure. Money digging began in earnest with discovery of a seer stone. Now, do you know the word seer? Anybody know what that word is? Sally?
It's somebody who can supposedly see the future and predict it.
Right. Someone who can see the future. And so he found this stone that he said enabled him to look into the future or to see things that were not evident to others. And he discovered it while digging a well. He said he could see wondrous sights in it. He could see ghosts, infernal spirits, mountains of gold and silver. So that kind of fit into his previous activities. His parents religiously were nomads. What's a nomad? Sally?
Somebody who doesn't particularly have a spot or a place they belong, they kind of travel around, this or that.
Yeah, they wandered from one church to another, from one religion to another, one denomination to another. So that left Joseph without much of a foundation at all. So you can get the impression maybe of what kind of a person he was as he exited his teen years. Any questions? All right, so in that context then, we find the start of the cult comes with his first vision in 1820. He was confused as he saw the awakening occurring in the burned over district, experiences around him, and he wondered which church should he go to. Well, somewhere along the line he had heard James 1:5, which seemed to indicate that he should ask God for wisdom and it would be given to him. And so he prayed to God to tell him which church he should go to, which one's the right church of all these that are around. Well, as he was out in the woods praying, 3 personages appeared to him, and one of them said, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." And he was told by the Son not to join any of them, because all their creeds were an abomination in his sight. So none of the churches are right. He had his second vision a couple years later, 1823. And in this one, he was visited by the angel Moroni and was told that God has a work for him to do, and that a book had been deposited written on golden plates, not just stone, on gold. And on these plates was given an account of the former inhabitants of America. You know, before Europeans came, even before the Native Americans that he knew. And also there was the fullness of the everlasting gospel delivered by Jesus to these people. So he's told that Jesus came to America and brought the gospel to these inhabitants. And that gospel was not something that any of the churches at Joseph's time had. They were all an abomination. And so he was going to be given the true gospel. He also was told that the Urim and the Thummim were there for the purpose of translating these golden plates. Now, what are the Urim and the Thummim in the Bible? You recall that, Caleb?
Weren't they tools used to determine God's will?
Yeah, and who used them? Remember?
The high priest.
Yeah, the high priest. And there apparently were two stones, the Urim and the Thummim, and we don't really know how they worked, but it was some way for God to communicate to the high priest. So he's told, well, they're here. They're buried there with the golden plates, and they're going to help you to translate these golden plates because they're not written in English. And so he had this vision where to find these plates. All right, any questions so far? So he found the plates. He went and dug where he was told. And he was told, okay, now you found them, but now you got to put them back and come back in 4 years, and then you'll be given the plates. So he did that. And then after he dug up the plates, for 3 years he dictated his translations, shielded by a curtain. So he sat in a room. He had the golden plates there, but no one else was allowed to see them. So he had this curtain put up. And as he had used the Urim and the Thummim to look at these golden plates, he was translating it out loud to someone sitting on the other side of the curtain who was writing down what he said. Any questions? Joseph Smith claimed that the language of these that was on these golden plates was Egyptian hieroglyphics. And so he tried to raise money for the purpose of publishing his translation. And so he went to a potential financial backer and told that person that these characters were Reformed Egyptian. He took a copy to Professor Charles Anthon in New York City, who he said identified the writing as Egyptian, Chaldaic, Assyriac, and Arabic. Now, if you know anything about those languages, what would it be like to have words written using those 4 different ways of writing? What's Egyptian writing? What's hieroglyphic writing look like? It's pictures, all right? So you've got pictures. And then what's the next one? Chaldaic. Chaldaic is similar to Hebrew, all right? So then you've got that mixed in. Then you've got a Syriac, and I'm not sure what that looks like. Arabic. Have you ever seen Arabic writing? Now, how could you possibly put those different forms of writing together and make any sense? You really can't. I mean, the closest would be Arabic and Hebrew in a way, because they both do go right to left. But it would be a monstrosity, as it says there. Now, someone later went to this Professor Anthon and asked him about his apparent verification of what Smith had said about these the language on his plates, and the professor said the whole story is perfectly false. He said it never happened. But that's the claim that was made. Well, subsequent to this, Smith and his companion, whose name was Cowdery, saw John the Baptist. And John the Baptist conferred on them the priesthood of Aaron. John the Baptist was of the Levitic tribe, so I guess there's a connection there. So he conferred the Levitic priesthood on these two guys. And so they began to prophesy and understanding the true meaning of the scriptures. Well then, later on, Peter, James, and John appeared to them and conferred upon them the Melchizedekian priesthood, which is the priesthood of Jesus. Jesus was not of the tribe of Levi. We're told in Hebrews that he is of the priesthood of Melchizedek, which is outside of Israel. And so Peter, James, and John conferred that on him. So Joseph Smith, he's got the Levitical priesthood, he's got the Melchizedekian priesthood, he's got these golden plates with the true gospel, and he's translating. You know, things are really going well for this guy who was a treasure seeker and a seer stone looker. Any comments or questions? All right, so then he engaged with not only the translation but also the publication of these plates, and he called it the Book of Mormon. At this point, he allowed some people to be witnesses to his the plates. They were able to see it, and then he published the book that went on sale in Palmyra, New York, 1830. He claims that this book gives American history from the original settlement up through the 5th century A.D. And he says that there were people called the Jaredites who came to America from the Tower of Babel, and they ended up destroying themselves. Then we have the Lamanites, who are the American Indians, who warred against God's chosen people, who are called the Nephites. And this warfare took place for hundreds of years until AD 384. There were a few Nephites that survived, including the man called Mormon and his son Moroni. Remember, it was Moroni that appeared to Joseph before. Mormon is the one who buried the tribal records in western New York until a true prophet should arise to dig them up. And that true prophet was Joseph Smith. All right, that's the backdrop of how Joseph Smith began to start this organization, this religious group. All right, what do you think? Sound credible or incredible? Yeah. Now, if you talk to a Mormon, they will tell you that there is all kinds of archaeological evidence to verify the existence of the Nephites and all the stuff that's in the Book of Mormon. But ask them for an example. And there's strange silence. There is no evidence. You would think if there was this vast civilization that had been here in America, that maybe we would have found one coin on some archaeological evidence, but there's absolutely none, which is understandable because it never existed, it never happened. All right, any comments or questions about what has happened so far? All right, let's see what happens then. The organization of the church, and he calls the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Latter-day indicating that this is the end times. And that started April 6, 1830 in New York with 6 members. Within a month, they had 40 members. Here in the middle of New York State. Received persecution from people in that area, that and the desire to reach the Indians, because the Indians are mentioned in the Book of Mormon. And so Smith said we need to go bring the gospel to them, bring the word to them. And so they moved out to Kirtland, Ohio, because this was Indian territory in the early 1800s, a large part. Anybody ever been to Kirtland? You know where Kirtland is? Anybody? It's east of Cleveland. Anybody ever been to Willoughby, Mentor, Painesville, Willowick, Wycliffe? It's in that area. It's just north of, I'm trying to think, Cuyahoga Falls, Solon, north of Solon. Yes.
Are there still like remains or things left over from
In
this
Kirtland?
church?
Yeah. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Because while he's there, they want to have a mission to the Indians. They developed a communistic type of community. In other words, everybody shared together. They purchased large tracts of land. They founded a bank in Kirtland. Kirtland was, not real settled. Back then, today, Cleveland suburbs go all the way out there, and it's all city. They also built a temple. Joseph Smith received the dimensions and the instructions on how to build it from God himself. So he built a temple, and that is still there. I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. He also published a second book called Doctrine and Covenants, and that is considered on a par with Scripture as well. Smith taught that the present world system was coming to a close with Mormons inheriting the earth. There's a picture of the temple as it still stands today. It's the first Mormon temple. Very symmetrical, it's exactly straight. There are, 1, 2, 3, 4, with 6 windows on top, on the bottom. It's the same on both sides, and the front and back are both the same. On the inside as well. As you look here on the inside, if you look towards this direction, if you came up here and looked the other direction, it would look pretty much the same. So there's not like in most churches today where there's a focal point at the front. There are focal points on both sides. And I would suggest you visiting that. It's an interesting place. It's open to the public. You can go in and look around. It doesn't cost anything. The Mormon Church is no longer in charge of it, and I'll explain this maybe a little bit later. It's the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who say that Brigham Young stole the church from them. They're the true followers of Joseph Smith, and so they're the ones that have the deed on the temple, and they have another building that they meet in nearby. Well, in 1837, there was a financial panic, and the bank that they started failed, and people started suing them, and it became dangerous for them there in Kirtland. So it was decided to move further west to Missouri. So the majority of the followers of Smith moved to Jackson County, Missouri, which is near Independence, or where Independence is. And he received a revelation that this is the land of promise and a place for the city of Zion. So this is the place where the kingdom of God will be located. But the populace there was not too keen on these Mormons being there and began to attack them. Mostly fear, they weren't afraid of their doctrine, they were afraid they were going to buy up all the land around. And so they moved north, founding a town called Far West, Missouri. And from there they organized a band of guerrillas called the Danites, who retaliated for their persecutions and warred on the state militias. So they had a military operation in which they were attacking people who attacked them, and even made fought battles against the state militia. Smith and the leaders were imprisoned, and most of his followers fled across the river to Illinois. Smith escaped and rejoined his flock across the Mississippi River in Illinois. Any questions? All right, so they make an establishment at Nauvoo, Illinois. The city that they started was granted a charter in return for support of the Whigs in 1840. So kind of a quid pro quo, we'll support you in your political party, and the Whigs were in charge in Illinois, and so you give us a charter and we'll support you. Smith had unusual powers given to him as mayor of this city. He organized the Nauvoo Legion, and he called himself its lieutenant general. So here's the mayor of a city, and he's got his own army, and he's the lieutenant general of this army. At this time, they began sending out missionaries, sent missionaries to England. They won many converts from the factories. The people in the factories, the men working in factories, were living in less than ideal conditions, and this promise of the Mormons made sounded really good, and so many of them became followers of Mormonism and ended up moving to Nauvoo, making it the largest city in the state of Illinois, 15,000. And the Mormons lived there from 1840 to 1846. Now the height and depth of Joseph Smith is this. In 1844, he ran for president of the United States. What was his platform? He was going to abolish slavery and free criminals from prison. I'm not sure if anybody would vote for, said, I'm going to free all the criminals. I'm sure why would anybody vote for him there? I don't know. But that was two of his major points as he's running for president of the United States. Before this, though, he'd received a revelation in 1843 which gave him authorization to practice polygamy. You know what polygamy is? Yes? Apparently, Joseph Smith enjoyed having the ladies around, and so he received a revelation saying, yeah, you're supposed to have more than one wife. Then he was arrested for destroying the opposition newspaper. He had this little army, and a newspaper was printing stuff against him, and so they just went and destroyed it. And he was taken then to Carthage, Illinois, to the city jail. Well, a mob attacked the jail and killed Smith and his brother Hiram. So he went from running for president to being killed by a mob in a jail. Questions, comments? Now this was totally unexpected. I'm reminded of Alexander the Great, who had no plan for who would succeed him. Joseph Smith had no plan because he didn't expect to die. And so it kind of threw the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints into a little bit of a turmoil as to, okay, who's going to take over now that Joseph Smith is gone. And so we enter into the young years, and that is as Brigham Young becomes the leader. His background was that he was born in Vermont, He was a farmer carpenter, settled near Palmyra, where Smith was receiving revelations. That's how he got in connection with Smith. He was baptized into Latter-day Saints by Smith, settled in Kirtland, became an elder, one of the 12 apostles. He toured England, settled in Missouri, and he became the senior member of the 12. Went back to England and returned in 1841. Was in Boston working for Smith's presidential bid when Smith was killed. That's a little bit of the background of Brigham Young. And you don't really need to be concerned with too much there, except that he had become a leader, especially of the 12. So the question of a successor had never been discussed. There were 4 people that claimed the right to lead the LDS upon the death of Joseph Smith. First was Sidney Rigdon. He was an ex-Campbellite minister until young Joseph could lead. So in other words, Joseph Smith had a son, but he was too young to be the leader. And so Sidney Rigdon said, I'll take over until young Joseph is old enough. I'll rule for him. You know, kind of like what happens with kings when a king dies and the next king is too young to lead, the queen or some kind of a protectorate will rule for them. So that's what he decided. But the thing is, he had been repudiated the previous spring. So Smith had apparently said he was wrong about something and had wanted to get rid of him. Brigham Young was one. He was Smith's favorite. He was in the Quorum of 12, of which he was president, and not the Council of 50. So he said the Quorum of 12, the 12 leaders should be in charge, not this other group, the Quorum of 50, or Council of 50, should lead the church. Another one was James Emmett, who was a Council of 50 member. So you can see there's a little bit of contention between these two groups. He led a company into Iowa against Young's orders. Later, he rejoined the Saints at Nauvoo, but was later excommunicated for causing desertion in Florence, Nebraska. So he apparently just kind of goes off on his own, and so he was kind of dismissed. Lyman White favored the Council of 50 and reacted against Young. So he ended up just taking a group by himself into Texas without Young's blessing, and was excommunicated. So every one of these gets eliminated for one reason or another, which leaves Brigham Young as the only one left. Then to top it all, as Rigdon and Young are trying to exert their influence, and this is the coup de grace. Young gave a speech upon which one person writes, many of those who listened to Young's speech suddenly thought that they heard the voice of Joseph and saw the face of the prophet instead. So in other words, while Brigham Young is speaking, all of a sudden it sounded like Joseph Smith's voice. And all of a sudden they saw Joseph Smith's face on Brigham Young. Well, that's interesting. Okay, Brigham Young's got to be the one. Joseph Smith has chosen that for us. It was a miracle. Joseph had personally placed his mantle on Brigham. The other pretenders were excommunicated and delivered over to Satan. The great Rigdon himself, although their sacred books declared him equal with the prophet. So Rigdon is declared in, I think it's Doctrine and Covenants, one of their books, he's declared to be a great prophet. And yet they excommunicated him later. Brigham Young established the post of seer, revelator, and president of the Latter-day Saints. So as he becomes leader, he gives himself these titles: seer, revelator, and president of the Latter-day Saints. And tomorrow we'll see what he does in his leadership, where he takes them, and takes us up to the present day. Any questions about this beginning of the Mormons?
So if Mormonism is considered a cult, would Masonry be a cult too?
Okay, why do you ask that question?
I don't know, I just thought of it earlier.
Interesting that a lot, if you look into the the practices of Mormonism, especially the initiation ceremony and all that, Joseph Smith took those directly from Masons. So they're very similar.
Okay.
Yeah, so the Masons are not Mormons. Joseph Smith took a lot of the things that they did and brought it over to Mormonism. Masons are much older than this, so they wouldn't classify as a cult based on our definition, but they are they're cult-like in some ways in that they believe things that are not scriptural. Not that everybody in the organization, but the tenets of Masonry is certainly not a biblical one. It goes back to sun worship, is where it is. Now, most people who are Masons don't know that at all. You have to get into the upper levels in order to understand what the beliefs are behind what they do. So interesting you brought that up. Any other questions? All right, you have an assignment for Monday that I gave you yesterday. Make sure that you complete that. That is to read pages 236 to 238. Do questions numbers 6 through 8 on page 239 and non-sentences. How many of you have done that already? Okay, almost everybody. Good for you. See you on Monday.